Alec Lasley from the Hoosier.com joins us now. How are you, sir?
Good, guys. How you doing?
Can't complain. Dylan and John were talking before I jumped on here, but uh, another just collapse by this Indiana team that just cannot seem to put a full 40 minutes together on the road for whatever the reason ends up being. But that was just an epic collapse under those turnovers last night. And it was just like watching someone die almost. It's like, man, this is painful.
Yeah, I don't know a better way to put it other than it was just a complete meltdown, right? I mean, Indiana's now we've seen this every single road game, whether it's in the first 10, 15 minutes of the game or whether it's in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the game. Indiana can't put together a full 40 minutes, but even more so, if they are within a few points in the second half, once we get to about that 5 to 6 minute mark, for whatever reason, Indiana just completely falters. It doesn't matter what happened in the first 25, 30, 35 minutes of the game. Those last 5 minutes, 6 minutes, for whatever reason, Indiana cannot put together any kind of string of runs. They can't put together any sort of good offensive possessions. They can't string together 2-3 stops that they were getting, even just 30 seconds a minute before. And it's now becoming obviously very, very concerning for Indiana because they need to win on the road. They can't continue to lose every single time they travel somewhere because they're probably not going to win out the rest of the way at home. That's just obviously you would love to see that happen, but there's going to be games where they just aren't 100% at home, and you need to be able to win these types of games. This week was extremely important for Indiana, right? A road game at Iowa, a road game at Nebraska to potentially put themselves at 5-2 in conference play with a huge matchup against Purdue coming up next week. And now you take two huge steps back after a great step forward that they had against Ohio State and Minnesota. And it's the same team almost that we saw last year, that we saw the year before, where they're just not able to put together a big momentum swinging week in which they really, really needed this week.
I agree. And it is not only a problem, it's scary because they haven't gotten into the meat of this Big Ten conference. You're early on already. And these problems are exposed, and all these other teams obviously are watching and saying, well, here you go. The success is being, or the formula is being handed to them on how to handle this. It seemed like there was a lot of similarities between this and the Wisconsin game. The lead was not quite as large, but the end of the first half, they had a 10-point lead with 2 minutes to go. It gets whittled down to just 7, but still, they let that get whittled down, open up to the second half. Within a minute, it's a 3-point game. And that's after all that was on the heels of Indiana going on a 20-4 run. It's like they go on those big runs, and then they puff out their chest, and then they relax, and the other team says, hey, we're in trouble, so they keep coming, and as they give it back. And I kept seeing Indiana give back everything that they would work for last night, mostly through turnovers, unfortunately. 3 games this year with 20-plus turnovers already. That is an unheard of number for any kind of team that's going to have any type of success.
Yeah. I mean, you look at those last 2.5 minutes of that first half last night. I talked a little bit about it last night right after it happened. That was unbelievable how much they just pissed away that lead. That should have been a 13 to 15 point lead going into halftime, and instead it was a 7-point lead. And you may look at that right and say, well, taking it down from 11 to 7, that's not a huge deal. But the thing that really got me was Iowa was just 1 for 9 over that last 2.5 minutes in the first half. Indiana picked up 5 fouls. They turned the ball over 3 times, and they just took that negative energy and that negative momentum right into the second half. And they did the exact same thing there in the second half, just over a course of 20 minutes. And that was obviously a really concerning 2.5 minute stretch, because it was one where we saw almost the same thing against Wisconsin in the first half, where Indiana was up 22, had a chance to push it to maybe 25, 26 going into the half. But instead, it was a little mini 4-6-0 run for Wisconsin, very similar to what Iowa did. And they just aren't able to respond, right? They did a good job against Minnesota and Ohio State responding to some of these mini runs that they went on. And last night we saw it for the most part in the first half, that game of runs where Indiana would go on a 12-0 run, Iowa would go on an 8-0 run, then another 10-0 run, but they were always able to respond with some sort of momentum stopper for Iowa. And in the second half, it just completely fell apart. And obviously the offense has a lot to do with that, but my goodness, if you're not able to stop Chris Murray, who's not even the best brother on that team, and Keegan Murray is the one who's sitting in foul trouble all night, and you still give up 83 points to Iowa. I mean, there's bigger issues defensively, and then I think a lot of people expected going into this game, even against a really good Iowa team, and that's just really concerning. The same thing happened against Champaign with St. John's, where they were unable to stop one player on the opposite team, and now you look into Big Ten play, and they struggled with that against Johnny Davis too with Wisconsin. And if they're not able to stop one player, like other teams have been able to do against Trace Jackson Davis, most importantly Penn State, how they were able to completely derail Indiana's offense by locking down Trace Jackson Davis, that's a huge concern moving forward, even if you just wipe away all the turnover issues, because defensively is where Indiana needs to hang their hat on, which they have all season. But if you're not able to stop a guy who averages 9 points a game and it goes out and puts up 29 on you, then that's a bigger issue in itself than anything that Indiana did offensively, in my opinion.
Agreed. Dylan?
Yeah, I guess my question, Alec, is going back to the turnovers for a second, because we've seen Indiana. We saw Indiana struggle early in the season with turnovers. We knew it was an issue, and then they really seem to have cleaned it up in recent games. I believe it was over the last 5, they were averaging 9.6 turnovers, which would have been a top 10 rate in the country. They only had 6 turnovers against Minnesota all game. Was there anything Iowa was doing differently defensively to force the turnovers beyond just obviously playing at home? I know obviously they were pressing, obviously they were playing zone, but is there any particular reason Indiana struggled so much to hold on to the ball as opposed to these last few games?
Yeah, I mean, you look at Iowa in the press that they had in the second half, right? You had the ball in Race Thompson's hands a lot in that kind of half court moving up into, in full court moving up into the half court. We heard Mike Woodson talk about that a little bit after the game, how that wasn't the huge issue there. But you look at Xavier Johnson, and he's one guy who can only play in one speed, at least consistently up to this point. And you can't have that when you're going up against the press. And Rob Finney regressed a lot last night when I thought he was really starting to break through for this team coming off of the bench. Obviously did really nothing for Indiana last night except for turning the ball over, which you can't have obviously as a point guard. But the biggest thing with them, they just looked either way too aggressive with Xavier Johnson or way too timid and reserved with Rob Finney. And you need that middle portion where you know when to attack and you know when to pull it back. And they don't have those different speeds right now. And going back a little bit to even the zone that Iowa had, Indiana's still not a good 3-point shooting team, right? Parker Stewart, I've talked about this before, has masked a lot of those 3-point shooting issues that Indiana continues to have. And we see it now in conference play. I think they're only shooting 32.5% in conference play from 3. As opposed to almost 40% in the non-conference. A lot of that has to do with teams now going to zone and really forcing Indiana to either, one, beat them with Race Thompson at the free throw line, or figure out some way for Xavier Johnson, Rob Finney, Miller Kopp, Jordan Geronimo to beat you from the outside. And when your point guards aren't able to get the ball in the middle, you take away what Race Thompson does best, and that's a calming influence in the middle of that zone and in the middle of that defense. And you just struggle to do anything else outside of that. So it's, again, kind of very, very concerning for this Indiana team. And, they had 21 turnovers in the last 3 games combined. And obviously they had 14 in the second half alone against Iowa. It was just an absolutely terrible last 20 minutes for the Hoosiers there.
Yeah, statistically, I don't know how you can. If you looked at the stats from last night's game, it's like a tale of two cities. Indiana shoots 51%, but Iowa gets 10 more shots off. Indiana turns the ball over 23 times. That gave 34. That is the highest number I can remember ever saying for anybody. 34 points off of turnovers. That's an astounding number in and of itself. So
21 in the second half alone.
21 turnovers?
21 points off of turnovers in the second half alone.
Yeah, it just seemed to skyrocket.
That was half of Iowa's points in the second half were off of turnovers.
Yep.
And basically that's what you just handing points to your opposition, and just making your old hole deeper and deeper. And it's like it's an impossibility to climb out of that hole. But you have to give Iowa some credit. Most teams are not as efficient as they were last night with those turnovers. Man, they feasted on them. They didn't waste a single one of them.
So here's what I will say, if you'll allow me real quick, is absolutely. that is kind of Iowa's MO. I saw Iowa play Purdue at Mackey Arena earlier this season, and I will say Indiana is not the only one who has had issues with turnovers against Iowa. Purdue was up by 19 in that game with about 10 minutes left, and Iowa did the exact same thing. They turned the ball over, they got out in transition, they cut that lead to 2 with about 2 minutes left. Purdue by 17,
and that's on the road, so you can imagine how difficult it is in Carver Hawkins.
Right, and so it might not be. This might not be a problem that's limited to IU, and I think Iowa's going to win some games in the Big Ten this year. But the fact that the difference in those games was that Purdue had built up a 19-point lead, and Indiana hadn't.
Well, and I think you've seen this before, Alec, with Indiana. This is not the first time they've done
absolutely,
this.
Yes.
Well, and a more concerning part is India, if you turn the ball over 23 times, obviously that's terrible in itself, but it's when those turnovers come and it's how those turnovers come. If they're all dead ball turnovers, then that's going to impact a lot of what that opposing team is going to do. A lot of those turnovers last night were in live action and resulted in a quick 2 points the opposite way. And that's the biggest thing that Iowa does, going back to that Purdue game too, is they force teams to turn the ball over in live action because of that pressure, because of that zone, and because of that tempo that they have. They spread you out when they come down in the fast break or even that secondary break, and they put 4 shooters around Keegan Murray, and you kind of pick your poison with that. But Indiana struggled with this even dating back to last season and the year before, and the previous staff for the last 4 or 5 seasons here, is most of their turnovers are live ball turnovers. And if you're going to hang your hat on defense, you're not going to be able to set your defense in the transition game. So you need to figure out a way of turning the ball over and throwing it into the crowd if you're going to turn it over 23 times. Because if you continually do that and do this in live action, it doesn't matter if you turn the ball over 10 times or 24 times. It's still going to result in a lot of easy buckets for the opposing team.
Last night was the second 5+ turnover game for Race Thompson, which that can't continue. Xavier Johnson with 4 turnovers last night, and also I think, what did Finney? He only had 3. No, those are fouls.
No, he had 4. He had 4
turnovers. Xavier Johnson had 4 turnovers and 4 for Finney. Those 2 guys, that's the problem. But Race Thompson also, I can think of 2 games where he's had a total of 13 turnovers. That's also an astounding number. You can't have that from a guy who you want to feed a lot.
Yeah, and you look at the 2 games, right? It's Iowa and Syracuse. The 2 games where they extended the pressure and they took the guards away from Indiana, because the guards struggled, obviously, with turnovers against Syracuse as well. And so you try to put the ball in Race Thompson's hands, who is a very skilled passer himself, especially for his position. But he's not going to be able to carry the load when you don't have 2 guards who can handle the ball. And so you can't. Yeah, obviously he should not be turning the ball over that much. But at the same time, you can't expect him to only have 1 or 2 turnovers when the guards themselves have 4 each. So that's just a testament to the lack of confidence I think Mike Woodson has in his point guards right now to handle the ball, because he knows they have not been consistent throughout the entire season.
One thing that seemed like go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the other thing with Race is that there were times where I think Iowa saw something on film. I think they did their homework and watched that film against Syracuse. And there were a lot of times where Race Thompson caught the ball in the short corner against the zone where Iowa just sent a second guy at him immediately and just sprinted two defenders at him. And I think that he was not great in those situations in terms of finding the right guy to pass the ball. Because obviously, as Mike Woodson likes to say, there's someone open when you get a double team. And Race Thompson did not do a good job of handling that last night. Didn't do a good job of handling it against Syracuse. And I think that might be something. Iowa is a pretty unique defensive team in what they do, but I think that might be something we see more often from other teams is sending a double at Race, because he seems to struggle a little bit in finding the open guy when that happens.
He seemed to really get frustrated. I have not seen him frustrated this season. Last night, he just looked pissed all night long. He was just frustrated, like he felt handcuffed. It seemed.
We saw at the end of the game where he had that ball taken away from him by Connor McCaffrey, and then he just shoved McCaffrey out of bounds. That was obviously frustration at the way the game had gone. And I mean, Race Thompson is a really, really tough player. He does not get the ball taken out of his hands like that when he's playing his game. And that it was just kind of a microcosm of everything that was going on.
Exactly. Five Left says that, and I'm not pointing at Rob here, but says Rob kept hesitating bringing the ball up last night. It wasn't just him. That's another thing. Why did they were so methodical in trying to break it that it seemed to me that they kept allowing Iowa's defense to set better every time on that and be in better position each time. They just did not seem to attack that zone, or I mean the pressure at all. They were just too deliberate. And I asked Woody at the end of the game about Race Thompson bringing the ball up the floor at a critical juncture like that, and he's like, that's not a concern. He doesn't have problems in practice, but in a game where you've had 20 something turnovers and a particular person's had a high number of them, and who does not normally bring a ball up the floor, not who I want bringing the ball up the floor at that particular time of the game. And those are some things I think Indiana has to change. I know, but that's just my opinion. I know Woody wants to have a group of guys that can do everything. Well, that's fine, but I don't know that this is that group that can do that yet. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you look at if Race is bringing the ball up, you probably don't have anyone in the middle at half court there to try to break that full court pressure, and so you're stuck with two guys who are parallel to each other there, who are making it extremely easy for the defense to literally just stick out their hand and deflect a pass, which they did multiple times last night. And if I'm never going to talk about Mike Woodson in terms of X's and O's, because he's been there before. He's done everything right on the college level and at the NBA level. But one thing, he has not been able to adjust to zone defenses and full court pressure. And in the NBA, those are two things you don't see a lot of. You don't see a lot of full court presses for the most part in NBA games, and you don't see a lot of zone. And Mike Woodson has yet to adjust to any of those two things in live game action. And that's one concerning part. I will say, in terms of this offense, is some of those in-game adjustments when it comes to different defenses being thrown at you, because in the NBA it is strictly man-to-man, or every once in a while you throw out a box and one if you have a guy absolutely torching you. And Indiana has not been able to adjust with those two things.